Welcome back to Chapter 25, this time Part 3 as we conclude the 1920s. As I mentioned in a previous episode, with all the corruption under Harding's administration, he was known to kind of walk the floors, kind of worried and kind of wondering what he could do. I said it wasn't his enemies that kept him walking the floors at night, but his darn friends. Well, after he passes away, his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, assumes the presidency, and is kind of nicknamed Silent Cal, because he never really had a lot to say. However, his honesty and integrity kind of reassured the nation after the Harding scandals and death that things would be okay. And Silent Cal kind of carries on Harding's policies that were kind of pro-business, that were isolationist in nature. But what we also see is that he tries to limit the chance of future wars by signing the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Now, this was simply an agreement that the nations who signed it wouldn't use war as a means of diplomacy. But in reality, it's tough to enforce if somebody is willing to go to war. It takes another nation to try to step up to stop them. So good in nature, but it probably didn't really have the effect that Coolidge had hoped for. Now, even though Calvin Coolidge had won re-election in 1924, he chose not to run again in 1928, and so that opened the door for the Republican Herbert Hoover to run against the Democrat Alfred Smith. Now, even though these men had many similarities in their beliefs on kind of the economy and the role of government and people's ability for upward movement in society, they were very similar in many respects. However, the biggest difference probably came when it came down to prohibition, as Smith was kind of one that wanted to end it, and Hoover was looking to continue prohibition. And as you can see, when it comes down to it, Hoover won rather easily. But with that said, we'll take a closer look at Hoover's administration when we get to Chapter 26, because it's not long after he's elected that we see the stock market crash and the beginning of the Great Depression. So we'll look at him in our next chapter. And so what we'll do now instead is kind of look at some of the kind of cultural and social highlights of the 1920s. And when we look at heroes of the 20s, there's probably none bigger than Charles Lindbergh, as he was the first person to successfully fly across the Atlantic in his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. Now, in what took him just over 24 hours, he instantly became a national hero and had all sorts of parades and honors bestowed upon him. And he kind of signifies the time because a lot of these heroes will be kind of like daredevils. They'll kind of be doing things that test the boundaries of mankind and what we're capable of doing. And so Lindbergh really truly does become a national icon. Another famous aviator has to be Amelia Earhart then as well. And the famous story about her trying to attempt an around-the-world flight, and how her and her co-pilot, I guess, or passenger, were lost just before finishing it. Somewhere in the Pacific, they go down, and it's still not known today what happened or where they crashed. But Amelia Earhart really kind of caught the nation's eye as well, as she crossed the Atlantic and had other feats when it came to flying, and tragically was lost on that around the world flight. And as I had mentioned before, kind of accomplishment of great feats, we can't forget Gertrude Ederle, who famously swam across the English Channel. And if you think how difficult that would have been, in the cold water, and how long of a distance that was. So people were really truly trying to test human nature and our boundaries and capabilities, and became well-known celebrities because of it. And yet again, if we now kind of turn our attention to spectator sports, we've talked about before the growth and popularity of college football and the NCAA. While there's probably no coach more quoted or well-known back then and even today than Knute Rockne, the famous coach of the Notre Dame Fighting Illini, and the success that he had, and the national prominence that he brought to Notre Dame. And they're still one of the top, football schools in the nation today. However, the first $1 million ticket gate receipt, I guess, came for Jack Dempsey when it came to boxing, as boxing kind of really drew large crowds and popularity throughout the 1920s as well. But if we're talking about sports heroes, probably none were bigger than Babe Ruth, the Sultan of SWAT. This guy was hitting more home runs than other teams with all their players put together would. So he was doing things that others only dreamt of, and crowds would storm into Yankee Stadium to watch him, or listen on the radio, or try to wait to get an autograph and just a glimpse of the great Bambino. But the 1920s weren't just known for their sports and physical feats of human nature. Probably the greatest cultural advancement of the 1920s was this outpouring of literature, whether it be from Ernest Hemingway, who was probably the most influential writer, or Sinclair Lewis or F. Scott Fitzgerald. Many of these authors, kind of wrote about the times in which they were living, kind of talking about the rapidly changing life in the United States, from like small town USA to the big cities, and they frowned upon the materialistic pursuit of happiness that was kind of had gripped America. And some of these authors became so disenchanted with life in the United States that they actually fled to Europe to live out the rest of their lives. But we also witnessed kind of this new growth of culture in what becomes known as the Harlem Renaissance. And this really kind of symbolized the growing African American culture and influence, whether it becomes in the form of music and jazz, which kind of dominated the era, literature, poetry, or artists. We see famous poets and authors like Langston Hughes and Claude McKay, putting forth their work, which would be read and known by blacks and whites both. But out of all these Harlem Renaissance artists, probably none were more well-known or influential than Louis Armstrong. Because as you know, the 1920s takes on the nickname the Jazz Age, because these African American artists, as they moved from New Orleans in the South to the northern cities, they brought jazz and all their abilities and artistic abilities with them. And jazz comes north to northern cities like New York and Chicago, and becomes a popular type of music, truly an American music, that would be played in different establishments throughout the North as well. And so you can kind of see there's really this flourishing of culture and creativity throughout the 1920s. But that wraps up our look at the 1920s, and we'll be taking a look at the Great Depression in our next episode.